All right, Nate, you can go ahead. We are live. We have 100 attendees in.
Good morning. I'm Nate Coulter, the Executive Director of the Central Arkansas Library System, and I want to welcome you to the Central Arkansas Library System's National Day of Service in celebration of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who taught us so much about service to others in the community. Through his examples, we're grateful that you're taking part of this gorgeous day and this holiday to join with us in this virtual celebration. You know, Dr. King famously said, everybody can be great because anybody can serve. And that's the focus of this program today. We've got a lot of wonderful people who are examples of that in their lives, and they're going to talk to us throughout this several hour session. We'll take some breaks. There'll be opportunities to do other things besides listen to people. But we're very grateful that you're participating. You know, much of Dr. King's leadership of the civil rights movement in America was inspired by Gandhi's fight for India's independence. When King talked about service, he was clearly channeling Gandhi, who said that the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. Last week, I read an interview in the Kansas City Star of Sharice Davids. In 2019, she became the first Native American woman to serve in the United States Congress, representing a Kansas district on the suburban side, Kansas suburban side of Kansas City. In her interview, Congresswoman Davids spoke of how her single-parent mom had shaped the Congresswoman's views toward public service. The mom, Crystal Heritage, had a career in the U.S. Army and then retired and went to work for the U.S. Postal Service after she left the Army. And according to her daughter, Representative Davis, her moms felt like she had a purpose in both her jobs, to serve others. She would always ask her daughter, "What's your purpose?" The Congresswoman says she learned this from her mother, harping on that and asking that. She learned that she needed a purpose and decided it would be to help others, help other people. You know, the thing about helping other people, serving people, is that when we do it, we're also helping ourselves. All of my life, from probably my adolescence to my early adulthood, I kept hearing people tell me, "Nate, when you do something for others, you'll get more out of it than they will." And I didn't always listen or believe that, but it's absolutely true. I'm now old enough to know it's true. In his book, Standing for Something, Gordon Hinckley, who was the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President George W. Bush in 2004, wrote that one of the great ironies of life is this: he or she who serves almost always benefits more than he or she who is served. The reason for that's pretty clear, and it goes back to Congresswoman Davids' mother's careers in the Army and the post office. Serving gives purpose. A lot of studies have established that people who feel connected to a purpose in their lives, to something outside themselves, something bigger than themselves, are happier, healthier, more contented, have stronger relationships, and they're really more resilient in the face of adversity. The great physician Albert Schweitzer, who was a German medical missionary to Africa, once told a group of young people that he didn't know where they'd wind up, but he said, "The only ones among you who will be really happy are those who will have sought and found how to serve." A couple of years ago, we had a popular author come to speak at our annual book festival. Sebastian Junger had been a war correspondent during the Bosnian-Serbian War in the 1990s, and later embedded with American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's written several best-selling books, starting with one called A Perfect Storm back in the late 80s, I think. But the book he talked about the most when he was in town several years ago was one called Tribe. And in it, he analyzes how people in the military and civilians in war-torn countries thrived in the worst of situations because they felt they had a purpose every day. They had tasks to do, and they knew that the lives of their friends, their families, their neighbors, their fellow soldiers depended on them doing those tasks well. Youngers that had been evident in other tragedies like the German air raids on London in 1940 and 1941, where every night people had to scurry into these hardened shelters underneath the ground. The British Ministry of Health had feared that the Londoners would have more rampant mental health problems because of all this, but it didn't turn out to be the case. And clinicians studying the effect of the war later on the population of England concluded that when people felt that their service to their neighbor or their family might save somebody else's life, it gave them resiliency. Now, we're not thankfully called on to get people in and out of bomb shelters or to protect a fellow soldier from an IED, to serve and find purpose. We can find purpose in many by helping people in everyday ways. In a few minutes after we hear from Mayor Scott, our great coordinator of Be Mighty at the library, KK DeRossett, will tell you about some much less dangerous opportunities to help others and how you can be a part of something important to the health and prosperity of your community. I'm reading President Obama's memoir, and in it he tells a story about his mother. When he was a young child, you know, it seems like it's always mothers teaching us these important lessons. Unfortunately, as a father of three, maybe I didn't do as good a job as their mom, but she sat him down one day when he'd gotten into trouble at school for teasing another kid too harshly. And his mother simplified things. She told him, there are two kinds of people in the world. Those who think only of themselves and don't really care about what happens to others. And those who are able to imagine how others feel and they act accordingly. She asked a young Barack, which one of those types of people do you want to be? And he says it obviously had the intended effect and stuck with him all his life. President Obama's mother's question was really just a variation on perhaps Dr. King's most famous question, when he said that life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? Today, we're very fortunate to hear from someone who's living Dr. King's advocacy, and he's an example of what Dr. King talked about with service and doing for others. Mayor Scott has been our mayor for 2 years now after his election in 2018. He's been a dear friend of mine and a supporter of the public library for longer than that. Mayor Scott had been on the job less than a month when he came to speak to a large group of library supporters on an early Saturday morning one day in January of 2019. And he shared with us his plans to initiate the Frankly Reading Summer Series that would help numerous children improve their reading skills. Obviously, as the library director, that was very exciting to hear. Later that year, Mayor Scott created the office of the city's first chief education officer, and he appointed Dr. Jay Barth, another friend of mine, to that post. Under Dr. Barth's leadership, Little Rock initiated its first community schools model during the 2021 academic year. There are 4 schools that are part of this. And these schools integrate individualized student support services, expand and enrich learning opportunities, and operate as a neighborhood hub to provide other needed trainings and services for students' families. Now, the library, CALS, wants to support these community schools and this program by being part of that hub, by helping teachers, helping students and parents in a variety of ways. And one of those was made possible by the mayor and Dr. Barth recently, and thanks to a generous grant from the Walton Family Foundation. It's our new Count Up math tutoring program, headquartered at Children's Library on 10th Street and Jonesboro Drive, just south of the freeway. Thanks to Mayor Scott and our volunteer tutors, as of last week, 47 students are now receiving one-on-one math tutoring. Mayor Scott began his public service career in the office of the Arkansas's Governor, Mike Beebe, where he served for 5 years, first as Deputy Policy Director, and later as Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. While on Governor Beebe's staff, Frank continued his education, earning a master's degree in business administration from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. That degree, with a concentration in finance, complemented Mayor Scott's undergraduate degree in business administration from the Fogelman College of Business at the University of Memphis. Once he left Governor Beebe's staff and he was determined to put his finance training to work, Frank accepted a position as a community banker with First Security Bank, giving him insight into the issues facing small businesses across the city. At the same time, he continued to devote a significant amount of his time to serving both his city and state as a member of the Port Authority of Little Rock, Board of Directors for the Little Rock Port, and as a member of the Arkansas Highway Commission. As an associate pastor, youth mentor, and now mayor, Frank Scott lives out the values he learned growing up in Southwest Little Rock, the same area of the city where he now lives, and where we have two wonderful libraries, D. Brown Branch on Baseline and the Rooker Branch on Stagecoach. We're proud to be connected to that part of the city that gave us Frank Scott. Clearly, Mayor Scott is giving back to the city that invested him and shaped him, and reminding us regularly that serving others is the foundation of a purpose-filled life. So I want to thank you, Mayor, for your examples of service to others, and especially for joining us today. I know you have a busy schedule and you took time out to provide this wonderful video message we're now going to hear. So without further ado, here is Little Rock Mayor Frank Scott Jr.
Thank you, Nate, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service event. To the COWS team that diligently worked to develop today's program, I wish you success. To each of you joining virtually, I appreciate you. I'm joining you from the historic First Baptist Church in downtown Little Rock at the corner of 7th and Gaines Streets. It's one of the oldest Black congregations in Little Rock. Pastor Byers and the First Baptist family, thank you for allowing me to visit this great monument that is on the National Register of Historic Places. It is within these sacred walls that Dr. King preached here in 1963, 4 months before the March on Washington and the famous I Have a Dream speech. I have mixed emotions on today. On the one hand, I'm humbled and overjoyed at the recollection of the scope of change Dr. King and the civil rights movement pushed our country towards the end of legal segregation of African Americans in the South and other parts of the United States. Without him and the movement, perhaps we wouldn't have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which authorized the federal government to enforce desegregation of public accommodations and outlaw discrimination in publicly owned facilities and in employment. Or perhaps we wouldn't have the Voters' Rights Act of 1965, which according to the Department of Justice, was the most significant statutory change in the relationship between the federal and state governments in the area of voting since the Reconstruction era. While accepting the Nobel Prize for Peace, Dr. King said, "I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him." These triumphs paved the way for Southern Black leaders like me and caused tremendous hope. And because of his relentless work, our country grinds toward the continuous goal of a more perfect union. But today, I also grieve at the realization that our country is in the midst of one of its most trying times. While the country prepares to swear in its new president and vice president on Wednesday, we also face the ever-present reality of those who are willing to commit violence to halt one of the country's most sacred attribute, the peaceful transfer of power. The horror that gripped us as we watched the unrighteous insurrection on January 6 brought us, yet again, face to face with the hate so many have committed their life's work to ending. But that day is also a harsh reminder that the collective work from you and me requires our immediate and consistent attention to fight for the experiment of democracy as laid out by our founding fathers. It is with this in mind that I ask you this question today. What do you want? Yes, what do you want of your neighborhood, community, your kids' school if they're still at home, the business you operate or work for? Now that we've gathered to enrich our lives with important discussions about the civil rights movement and public service, what is it you want to take away from this experience? Would it be what Dr. King would have wanted as well? And is it worth your time and dedication to obtain it? The rousing, iconic I Have a Dream speech remains one of the most famous speeches in history. It was eloquent, captivating, poignant, and inspiring. It's a speech our children learn in school, and you may be able to recite some of it yourself. Before a crowd of almost 250,000 people at the March on Washington, King poured out his heart to America as he demanded economic and social justice and offered hope for what he dreamt our country could become. He expertly articulated what he came to Washington to do. As he put it, to cash a check. Dr. King urged those in power to make good on the promissory note that guaranteed unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while also vividly painting the picture of what true freedom looks like. Just as necessary to the movement as the I Have a Dream speech was Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. I love this letter because Dr. King held nothing back while he expressed the passion, agony, and impatience of the oppressed. It demanded urgent, immediate action and contains arguably one of the most famous phrases that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Dr. King admonished the moderate for asking Black people to wait for change, writing that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inability, but that it comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work, and without it, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. The theme of uniting Little Rock over my term as mayor has been greatly tested as we fight against the condition of stagnation with which we have become accustomed. It's difficult, but we're doing the work. We've made significant strides in economic and social justice, education, and in increasing equity in our city. For the first time ever, we created an incentives package to spur on economic development south of Interstate 630 and east of Interstate 30. We recognize the importance of schools to the life of a community and launched 4 community schools that will serve as neighborhood hubs with services to benefit the young and the young at heart. We've made free public Wi-Fi available in parks south of 630 and east of 30 for residents who don't have access to broadband in their homes. And we've launched a process to increase minority business participation in city contracts. These efforts, however, are not enough. In order to help Little Rock reach its true potential, we must be intentional about creating more sustained economic growth for those in our community who've been left out and left behind. We do this by continuing to do the work to unify our police department and strengthen the relationships with the parts of our community that have been over-policed yet underdeveloped. We do this by placing a greater focus on directing resources and opportunities for development in neighborhoods that have been neglected. And we do this by increasing access to early childhood education for all of our city's children. It's time to create universal pre-K. These bold steps towards economic and social justice must be done. They cannot wait. If we are ever to truly unite Little Rock, we must ensure that we give every resident the opportunity to reach their God-given potential. I asked you earlier, what do you want? And as you can see, my answer is a whole lot, and we can do it. I'm heartened whenever I read the letter from a Birmingham jail. It reinvigorates me, challenges my fortitude, and gives me hope that change surely can come. Yet, it is also a stinging reminder that doing good and doing right will produce critics who are fine with things the way they are, or those who want you to wait because the time isn't right. In the difficult moments, let the truth of Dr. King's letter resonate with you, that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action, or that the time is always right to do what is right. Let it guide your resolve to do the work to position your desires for our community on a path for attainment. Don't wait to act because we cannot afford you to. Thank you for letting me spend some time with you on this King holiday. Thank you, Nate, and thank you for...
Thank you, Mayor Scott. Now I'm going to share some volunteer opportunities. A lot of the participants, when they submitted their registration, they wanted to know how they could volunteer during COVID. And we have a few opportunities at the library, and then there's another opportunity in Northwest Arkansas that I wanted to share. So the first program is Count Up. It's a free after-school math tutoring program for students kindergarten through 12th grade in Central Arkansas. The program is located in Central Arkansas Library System's Children's Library and Learning Center. Count Up matches experienced tutors with students to provide personalized support and guidance. They're currently looking for volunteers with teaching experience or math-related experience in STEM and other fields. Students working towards education degrees and certifications, and bilingual individuals. Volunteers must be 16 years or older, pass a background check, attend volunteer training, and have regular availability on at least one weekday afternoon and or Saturday each week. If you're interested in volunteering, you can go to cals.org/tutoring and submit an application. Once your form is received, you'll be contacted for an interview. The next opportunity is through Be Mighty Little Rock. Be Mighty is a citywide campaign that connects kids and teens to free after-school, weekend, and summer meals. 10 of the Central Arkansas Library System branches serve as meal sites. We utilize Commit to Health's Foods of the Month curriculum for grab and go and virtual nutrition education programs. Be Mighty is housed at the Central Arkansas Library System, but we promote all USDA meal sites throughout the entire county. You can visit BeMightyLittleRock.org to find a meal site near you, and we currently need volunteers at D. Brown Library Monday through Friday, 3:45 to 5:30 p.m., and on Saturdays at D. Brown and McMath Libraries, 10:45 to 12:30. If you're interested in becoming a social media ambassador, you can send me an email at kderosset@cals.org, and you can visit cals.org/grab-and-go-meals to sign up to volunteer. The last volunteer opportunity is with Peace at Home Family Shelter in Fayetteville, Arkansas. So these volunteers will help with the crisis chat line by providing crucial support and an immediate response to those who are in crisis, experiencing trauma, need support, or are looking for resources. Volunteers work 2-hour shifts from home using their own computer, and there's a 6-month commitment expected of volunteers. Volunteers are expected to fulfill volunteer training as well as crisis line training. To apply, you can email Danielle at ddean@peaceathomeshelter.com. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll get started with the discussion of March Book 1 with Antwan, Phillips, and Nate Powell. Thank you.
Looks like it's maybe 1 minute after noon, so I think we'll continue. We have an exciting hour coming up with Nate Powell. And I thank all of you again for joining us, and thanks for staying with us. We have this discussion coming up on March Book 1 by the late Congressman John Lewis. Antwan Phillips will serve as the moderator of the program for us, interviewing a local contributor to that great book. On January 1, Antwan Phillips began serving as an at-large city director, which means he's one of 3 directors elected citywide. Director Phillips was elected to his first term just this past November, and so he's our newest Little Rock City Director, but I'm sure he'll quickly become one of the board's leaders. I've known Antwan for a while, and he is someone who is going to make a difference in City Hall, and people will listen when he speaks, I'm confident. Antwan was born and grew up in Little Rock, another product of Little Rock with us today. He's a graduate of John L. McClellan High School. After earning a degree in American politics from Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, he came back home to Little Rock, where he graduated from the University of Arkansas Little Rock's William H. Bowen School of Law. Director Phillips has practiced law for over a decade with the Wright firm, Wright, Lindsay, and Jennings, where he's a partner with a practice specializing in trucking litigation, dental malpractice, and municipal governmental relations. Director Phillips was recognized by Arkansas Business in 2020 as one of their 40 under 40. He's also served on the board of directors for Big Brothers Big Sisters of Central Arkansas, the Little Rock Public Education Foundation, the Little Rock Area Public Education Stakeholder Group, and the Pulaski County Imagination Library. He served as co-chair for the Think Big Little Rock Strategic Planning Initiative, which was charged with strategizing ways to enhance life in Little Rock and the surrounding communities. In keeping with the theme today of serving others, in 2017, Director Phillips, along with other alums of McClellan, demonstrated their commitment to that ideal by founding and funding the Friends and Alumni of McClellan Foundation. It provides scholarships for McClellan's graduating seniors. And in 2018, Antwan launched the Rock the Culture podcast to discuss and provide perspective and conversations on all things Central Arkansas, all things Little Rock, and all things culture. For a spell, they recorded this podcast at the library, and we were honored and glad and proud to be a part of that popular and growing podcast that so many folks listen to around here. Antwan and his wife, Tanisha, have been married for over 10 years, and they're members of the New Creation Bible Church. He's been a leader for education and a supporter of the Little Rock School District through thick and thin. He's a big friend and fan and supporter of the public library, for which I'm grateful. And I'm very pleased to call him here today to lead this panel, and know that he's now bringing the same kinds of talent and insights that he's provided for the community and these other endeavors. Now he's bringing those to City Hall. So thank you, Antwan, for your commitment to public service and for leading our discussion today.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Awesome to be a part of this celebration, this discussion, this reflection on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, and here in a few seconds about the life of civil rights icon John Lewis, which I'm fortunate enough, and I don't know how well everyone can see that, but that is a picture of me and Mr. John Lewis when he came to Little Rock a couple years ago. So I had the privilege of meeting him and interviewing him on that very podcast that Nate mentioned. And I will say we will be back to the library. We enjoy recording there once we get all this virus things behind us. And one other thing I want to mention about Nate Coulter before I do the introduction of our guest speaker. Before I announced that I was running to become an at-large member, Nate called me, and apparently he had an inkling because he said, well, I know one day you're going to run for something. And I said, well, Nate, that day is sooner than you think. And so I appreciate you being a friend, having my best interests and the city's best interests at heart. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Glad you didn't wait any longer.
And maybe we'll talk about weight today. In the mayor remarks, he mentioned the idea of waiting. And as Dr. Martin Luther King told us in the letter from the Birmingham jail, sometimes wait means never. So we don't have to wait. So I'm glad I didn't wait, and I'm glad to be a part in serving our city. Let me introduce Nate Powell. Nate Powell, like me, is a Little Rock native, and he is the first cartoonist ever to win the National Book Award. His work includes civil rights icon John Lewis' historic March trilogy, which we're going to discuss book 1 today. His works also include Come Again, Too Dead, Any Empire, Swallow Me Whole, You Don't Say, In the Silence of Our Friends. Powell's work has received the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, 3 Eisner Awards, 2 Ignatz Awards, the Michael L. Prince Award, the Comic Con International Inkpot Award, a Coretta Scott King Author Award, 4 Young Adult Library Services Association Great Graphic Novels for Teen Selections, the Walter Dean Myers Award, and he's a 2-time finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He's discussed his work at the UN, that's the United Nations, that's pretty big time, on MSNBC's The Rachel Maddow Show, PBS, CNN, and Free Speech TV. And after today, he can add the Central Arkansas Library System's Martin Luther King Day virtual event to his resume. Powell's forthcoming book, Save It for Later, will be released by Abrams Comics Arts in April of this year. He currently lives in Bloomington, Indiana. Without any further ado, Mr. Powell, we're all yours.
You bet. Can y'all hear me all right?
I can hear you fine. And let me say this, I should have mentioned this, Nate. For the audience, I will be moderating some Q&A after Nate finishes discussion. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat, or write them down and save them. Text them to yourself or to a friend. And we'll get to your questions once Nate's done with his remarks.
What we need are some more guys named Nate on this panel, though.
Stack them up. Well, thanks, y'all. And thanks, Antwan, for introducing me. Thanks to all y'all for having me. I don't want to waste anybody's time, so I want to leave as much time as possible for discussion, for questions, for pursuing what you guys want to pursue. I guess I'm just going to do a quick rundown of my path as it relates to working with Congressman Lewis and with Andrew Iden on the March trilogy. A lot that sort of went into the work in the first half of this decade, but specifically focus a little bit more, since this is a day of service, this is a day on. This is a day of finding solutions, finding ways forward. I'm going to try to focus a little bit more about taking that history, taking that account into the future from our present moment onwards. So yeah, as a quick rundown, March is a comics trilogy that is a first-person account of being a young person at the center of the civil rights movement. And it's told through the late, great John Lewis's eyes. It's told in his words. I was the artist for the March trilogy, and it was co-written by Congressman Lewis and by Andrew Iden. They put a couple of years of work into the script before I came on board as an artist. Its origins came from summer 2008, working on the Congressman Lewis's 2008 congressional campaign, where Andrew spent 14 years as a staffer for the congressman. And during a lot of those discussions throughout the summer, talking to people, campaigning, canvassing, a lot of the same questions came up. How do we reintroduce and revitalize the history of the movement? How do we counteract a lot of common misconceptions and assumptions about the movement? How do we reintroduce and kind of posit the urgency of civic engagement, particularly for young people? How do we do this in a way that fosters empathy and understanding? And basically, Andrew had been gently made fun of in the office a little bit for being a comic book nerd in this one incident. It was all in good fun, but Congressman Lewis overheard it, and he's like, "Don't make fun of him. There was a comic book when I was a teenager that was very influential on the organized nonviolence movement. And Andrew was like, well, number one, thank you, Congressman, for stepping in. Number two, what is this comic? So Congressman Lewis started talking about this 1957 comic called Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery Story. It was made by the Fellowship of Reconciliation. It was a 16-page comic that basically gave an overview of the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence, and sort of moved it into the 20th century Jim Crow South, and gave an overview and an account of the entire Montgomery bus boycott. It was very effective, but more importantly, it was used directly by Dr. King, by Jim Lawson, by other early leaders of what became the sit-in and stand-in movements during nonviolence training workshops. So it was literally being sold or given away out of the trunks of their cars, in church basements, in community centers, during the lead up in 1958 and 59 to the explosion of the sit-in movement in 59, 60, 61. Also, what's wild is it turns out Dr. King actively edited the book. Andrew was able to find during his research moments in which Dr. King actually was reviewing and sent in, handwritten editorial notes, page by page, and had an active hands-on role in the creation of this historic comic, which wound up being translated into a lot of other languages, was used by Cesar Chavez in the 1960s, labor movement, etc. It's got a long, fascinating history. But this comic and the role it played in nonviolent movements for justice and equality really struck a chord. So once I got on board, basically from 2011 through 2016, my life was living within the pages of this history, spending time with Congressman Lewis and Andrew, and absorbing and trying to apply Congressman Lewis's experiences, his reflections, and meld it with the history to make this comics trilogy. All right, so I was born in the late 70s in Little Rock, and during my elementary school years, I spent a lot of those years in Montgomery, Alabama. I grew up in a military family in childhood. My parents have lived there in Central Arkansas since '71. They're all from Northern Mississippi. But importantly, I think for a lot of people within Generation X with baby boomer parents, but I think more specifically, a lot of white middle class Generation Xers with baby boomer parents, I did receive a very basic working knowledge of some civil rights history as a kid in the 1980s. But what struck me even at that time was, being a kid living in Montgomery and hearing a mix of history and personal accounts and anecdotes from my parents. I like a lot of the history and a lot of these stories were sort of punctuated by kind of a disclaimer or an exception. And I think this is very, very common for the time. A lot of like, oh, but that was a different time. It's important for you to know that this here is not there. These are two different worlds. And so don't think about it too hard, but that was a different time. And then it struck me as strange. Like I didn't have the vocabulary for it or anything at the time, but a lot of these sites that I had visited with my family or with my classroom in downtown Montgomery, that might have been 3 miles from my house, stuff where I'd seen, grainy black and white footage and photography of these moments of history occurring, just like 10 to 15 years before I was born. There was this kind of disconnect where it was like, I can see in my own city where I live that this is a part of this continuum of time. This in fact is the same world. How could this be that different of a world, that different of a time? And it seems strange that there was that much effort kind of being put into establishing a divide. And I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of white people from the baby boomer generation just having a lot of baggage that still needed to be unpacked. And a lot of that would take decades still to unpack. So when I came on board to do the March trilogy, I tried to be very mindful of that. And that was sort of my personal guiding force, was a personal reckoning with this broader disconnect between people's history and shared history and the world in which I and my generation grew up in too, but also a larger intergenerational reckoning in itself. The Southern Poverty Law Center has coined a phrase which it refers to as the 9-word problem. And that's that most kids in America graduate from high school knowing 9 words about the civil rights movement, which is Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream. And so the sort of the second mission that we embarked upon while we were making the March trilogy was to do what we could to counteract the unintended effects of what is dubbed the 9-word problem. It's really hard to get a sense of the arc of civil rights movement history, of its successes and failures, of the way that decentralized leadership and activism works. You don't get a very clear picture of the movement itself using that kind of 9-word problem framework. And that's certainly what I grew up knowing, and for virtually everyone I know within my generation. And the more I learned about the movement, the more I learned about Congressman Lewis's life and his relationship with other leaders in the movement, especially as a young person, was that for John Lewis and for a lot of people who were part of the student movement, who were part of SNCC and part of CORE, this was very much an intergenerational reckoning within the movement, in as much as it was a reckoning between, with differences in philosophy and strategy and tactics between John Lewis and his generation and Dr. King, only 11 years older, and his generation. It was likewise a reckoning before that between Dr. King's generation and Thurgood Marshall's generation. And so recognizing, this concept of perpetual revolution, of constant reckoning, of not becoming complacent when reevaluating a collective position, when trying to make large, urgent social changes at this level. So together, Congressman Lewis and Andrew and I, we tried to use our personal strengths within our own skill sets. We used our own experiences and use the strengths of the medium of comics itself to kind of help other people not only understand a richer version, a richer account of civil rights movement history, but to be able to identify and, importantly, to empathize with other people's struggles. And I think the ability of comics as a storytelling medium, its ability to foster empathy is one of the medium's greatest strengths. And so our ability to read through the pages of March and get not only an objective historical account, but be able to understand it from a very subjective, intimate, personal place, to be able to balance both of these things, objective and subjective, are key to the power that March has been fortunate enough to hold as a piece of memoir, as a piece of history, and as a piece of literature. And to that effect, we had a mission to reintroduce history, to participate in the historical record wherever possible, but also as a means to process our present and our future. And so moving through the trilogy, as we moved into 2014, 2015, 2016, it became much more obvious that within the pages of March, that we were very much also speaking about our present moment in the United States. And often we would have, every few weeks, we'd have to have a collective conversation about that. Like, should we get in the ring, through Congressman Lewis's voice in the pages of the book to talk about the moment that we are in here in 2015 or 2016. And time again, our conclusion was, if we do our job, and if we tell the history to the best of our ability, then readers are all living in the same world as us. They are automatically going to be processing what this means for our present moment. So it's our job to tell the history and to have faith in readers to be able to make those connections. And as we all know from the world that that we have been trudging through throughout this decade, that's at the forefront of most people's minds. And I'm thankful for that. Keeping that at the forefront of our consciousness is essential for being able to move forward as a society. So making March, it turns out, I had my own kind of hardwired assumptions and misunderstandings of civil rights movement history, its structure, etc. And I kind of had to, like, a lot of this was a learning process for me. In some ways, it was like getting paid to go back to school to learn and relearn a large chunk of American history and its implications. But I guess the three major takeaways I had while I was at the drawing table over that 4.5 years was that, number one, a fundamental misunderstanding of the civil rights movement as a top-down movement. Andrew likes to refer to it as the story of the civil rights movement being a tale of gods and kings, of change coming down from a hierarchical leadership, and the change coming from the top being what actually pushed larger societal change. But what was at the forefront of Congressman Lewis's intent and concern while we were making the March trilogy was, even though he was a central leader within the movement and was the head of SNCC from 63 to 66, to recognize that the movement took great effort to decentralize leadership whenever possible, that the larger changes were the changes as a result of the effort, the risk, and the courage of hundreds of thousands of people. And so it became very important for us to kind of counteract that sense that civil rights movement, as it is commonly sort of misunderstood, was one in which change was enacted by leadership instead of coming up from the streets, from the power of the people. Also, I guess related to that is this idea that March is the story of a mass movement expanding beyond the ability of any one person to exist at its center. And I guess that's just like a side quest off of that first point. But it is really important. As we were telling this tale, both history and memoir, as we got into book 2, we recognized just from a position of being narrators that we were naturally reaching a point in which John Lewis, as narrator, was accounting for moments in which he could not have possibly been physically present. So as storytellers, eventually we had to recognize, yes, not only is this the reality, but this is the goal of this disciplined, organized, nonviolent protest movement, is it has to reach that escape velocity where it has its own groundswell of strength and organization that exists beyond the ability of a centralized leader to be present for all of it. And I think that's even best encapsulated by within March Book 2, during the March on Washington, the big six leaders of the movement, as they're recognized, had a quick meeting within the Capitol, gave a press conference, took some photos, and the plan was to be done with that and then lead the march through DC to the Lincoln Memorial. But when they left the US Capitol, to their shock and amazement, the march had already started without them. And I believe Dr. King's quote was simply, "There goes America." So there's a really famous photo from the big six leaders kind of arm in arm with a large column of marchers through Washington, DC. And Congressman Lewis notes in March Book 2 that they basically just hopped into the middle of the march with everyone else. That this is a true power of the people moment, and they're able to get some photos, but they're like, Congressman Lewis is like, truth be told, we couldn't even see the front. And I find that to be that's just amazing and something that really that falls through the cracks. Another really important point throughout the March trilogy that's especially relevant in 2020 and 2021 is in response to relatively modest gains in legal and civil protection and civil rights, highlighting a disproportionate reaction, backlash from forces of white supremacy, whether it's with physical violence and acts of terrorism, or whether it's reactionary white supremacist legislation. And so to really look objectively at the localized victories within the sit-in movement, which the Nashville sit-in movement, of course, is at the center of March Book 1, recognizing as we get into March Book 2, these accounts of, the desegregation on a city level of lunch counters throughout the city with no means to enforce those laws was counteracted by very overt attempts to murder members of the young student movement within Nashville. Our opening scene in March Book 2 is young John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette barely surviving a murder attempt at a Crystal Burger in downtown Nashville in the immediate aftermath of that first victory in the desegregation movement there. And I guess the third most important point would be the mediation of history. And I guess by that, I mean, like, March is a historical account of a nonviolent people's movement, but the success of that movement owes so much to the ability of a devoted free press to be able to cover these events and present them objectively to the American people. And so throughout the pages of March Book 1, of the three books, this has the most subjective point of view. A lot of it is because a lot of it, takes place during John Lewis's childhood. The other half of that is simply that in these first months of the organized nonviolence movement throughout the South, there simply was only a fraction of the media coverage happening on a local level, much less a national level, than what would happen throughout 63, 64, 65. And so throughout the trilogy, sort of having the presence of photojournalists and of reporters, of TV cameras, function as a character of their own, and sort of paying attention to the role that a free press plays in the ability of the American people to become aware, to process the information, to discuss it on their own terms, and to do something about it. And so, I don't know, importantly, simply that the civil rights movement, especially within SNCC, within CORE, recognizing a particular dynamic with the press that didn't involve press blackouts. There is sort of a dynamic tension between, when you're running a movement, I think this is also Bernard Lafayette, when you're running a movement, you act like there is no press. And at the same time, on an organizational level, making sure the press knows what you're up to, making sure you have press releases clearly stating your intent, your goals, and what the expected outcome was. And I think a lot of the successes of the movement, in particularly, I'm thinking of the Birmingham Children's March and the Freedom Rides, both covered in March Book 2, they owe a lot of their success by the ability to firmly establish their activist MO and their expectations from the get-go. And I don't know, with a lot of increased danger happening with journalists, with photographers throughout our current moment, it's really important to recognize the sanctity of a free press and understand the role that journalism plays in terms of getting so much of America on board with organized people's movements for equality and justice. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. Does that sound about right for y'all? Okay. So I don't know, moving a lot of this stuff forward, I think it's what's really important to pay attention to in the past years, in our present moment, and in moving forward, is when we are, as an overwhelming majority of the American people who are interested in and would like to do something to establish and preserve for actual freedom, actual equality, actual justice in order to get actual peace. It's important to note that fascism and the extreme right, the organization within the extreme right has always and will always observe and adapt from strategies used in people's movements for equality and for justice. It's important to note that March Book 3 ends basically with the signing of the Voting Rights Act on August 6th, 1965, or maybe August 8th, 65. Just 2 days afterwards, John Lewis, at age 25, was back in the streets in a small town in Georgia, working with a group of about 12 other protesters to desegregate one church there in that town. And across town on that same day, at the same time he was getting arrested for that protest, there was a white supremacist rally featuring an estimated 300 robed Klansmen. But importantly, this group of fascists this signaled a shift in strategy and in tactics. And a lot of that had to do with echoing and mirroring some of the instructions and strategies that had been used within the civil rights movement. And a lot of that had to do with ignoring people yelling, any physical altercations, basically adapting the strategies of organized nonviolence to mainstream white supremacy as an organized movement, and to make it more palatable away from the perceived extreme right. And this is something that's used now. We see how the Hong Kong protest movement had a lot of lessons for protesters throughout 2020 here in the United States, especially with the use of umbrellas, means of containing tear gas, means of being able to provide mutual aid for each other on the ground. A lot of these tactics and strategies were adopted by the American protest movement. And a lot of these strategies, again, are being incorporated by the extreme right in 2021. So it's always important to recognize that the forces of white supremacy are not static. They are evolving. And so in the same way that the successes and the failures within the civil rights movement cannot and should not be replicated precisely as they occurred in the 1950s and 1960s, because that simply won't work a second time. We all must evolve strategically and tactically. We have to learn that it's also true that the anti-equality forces are growing, adapting, and changing, and to be able to meet those where we can. So yeah, if you're interested, I'd love to open it up for questions and really go where you guys want to go.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nate, for sharing that background. There's some questions in the chat. I had one I wanted to get us started with, but before I go there, I just want to say that it is noticeable the joy that you have in having the privilege to work with Congressman John Lewis and write this trilogy. I can see when you talk about it. I mean, you're smiling, reflecting on the importance of his work and being able to share that with us and for it to be shared for generations to come. So I just want you to know I can see it.
Thank you, Antwan. I miss him every day. So it's the last time I saw him was December 1st, 2019. And we stayed in touch on the phone weekly after that, but not a day goes by where I don't wish he was here. Awesome.
There are some questions in the chat, and I'm gonna get to those, but I want to start with this one because this stood out to me, and kind of just want you to expound on it a little bit. You said growing up, and I think we still hear this today, but you said growing up, there was a almost concerted effort to separate time periods. You said, well, this is not that. Well, it happened in the 60s, but we're better now. It's the 80s, right? Or that happened in the 60s, but it's 2020. We're better now. Things are better than they were. despite us knowing that there's still a lot of challenges, and equality and equity has not been attained for everyone. So if you can just expound on that a little bit more, that kind of distinction, if you would, of how we always try to separate how it was in the late 50s and early 60s from whatever the present time is.
For sure. I think a lot of it is, it's a crucial point. And a lot of that has to do with, and a lot of this is without blame, simply talking about people being a products of their society, there being an incentive or an advantage to, for people as a product of privilege to be able to declare that a problem is solved. And so, a lot of that is a generational problem for, it's generational baggage for a lot of white baby boomers in the United States, particularly in the South. And that's fair enough. And like Generation X has its own baggage to unpack. And now that I'm a parent, a lot of that has to do with listening to my own kids when they call me out on something, and recognizing that when one's kids call you out on something, it's time to listen to that. In particular, I think there was a very strong sense that the most elementary way to encapsulate the civil rights movement during the 1980s was simply that racism was a bad problem, but there was the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement was a victory, and nothing was said beyond that point, but that naturally makes you reach this conclusion. We're like, oh, it was victory. And so you don't think about ongoing work, or you don't think about the fact that there can't be a true work. And the older we get, and the more we're processing and talking about things, and hopefully the more we're getting involved in that struggle, the more you recognize that the entire point is that the work is never done. As Congressman Lewis would often say, democracy is a state. It's something that you strive and work towards, but it's something that has to be maintained. And likewise, there can be no clean victory. People don't like unclean victories. But I mean, even in the pages of Making March, trying to figure out where to end the trilogy was really tricky, because we're like, we really want to take care to make sure we're not falsely giving this idea that it was a clean victory. So Congressman Lewis at the end of book 3 kind of had to be very plain that with the signing of the Voting Rights Act, he considered it the end of the movement as he knew it. His work continued literally 2 days later, but sort of establishing that if you have to bookend history, you have to make that decision, but you have to be willing to recognize that there is no actual victory. The victory is the ongoing movement and work of people within the United States to establish a more anti-racist society.
Awesome. Now, and I want to get to the questions, but you mentioned something that we may have to come back to, but you talk about how privilege allows you to declare a victory. And I think a lot of times what we hear today, and I know our mayor mentioned it when he was addressing the letter from the Birmingham jail, sometimes privilege also allows people to determine how to attain what the process should look like to get whatever we perceive the victory to be. And I know Dr. Martin Luther King he took issue with that, obviously, in his letter, but I think that's a very salient point. And I'm put a pin there. If we have more time, I want to get to it. One of the questions in the chat from Mark Chris says, did you learn of any unsung heroes of the civil rights movement while working on March?
Certainly. And I guess on one level, there were a lot of crucial players within the movement who were unsung to me simply because of the aforementioned 9-word problem. Like growing up, I did have a level of awareness of Fannie Lou Hamer, of Ida B. Wells, but frankly, until well into adulthood, I had a very minimal awareness of Amelia Boynton, no awareness of Bob Moses, of Amzie Moore, of Bayard Rustin, importantly. So as we moved through the trilogy, it became more and more important if we, and by extension, if Congressman Lewis was going to follow through with sort of decentralizing the history of the movement and sort of using this platform to elevate people who had been kind of swept under the rug of history. The people who amazed and inspired me the most, and also made me embarrassed that I didn't know the full depth of their contributions, included Bayard Rustin, the principal organizer of the March on Washington, and A. Philip Randolph's right-hand man for decades, who was kind of swept under the rug by more conservative civil rights leadership from the previous generation because he was gay. He was considered a strategic liability for a lot of the elders within the movement. And thankfully, one of those elders, A. Philip Randolph, kind of put his own involvement and reputation on the line to keep Bayard Rustin in a peak organizational state for the march. But yeah, Bob Moses, I think, is the other major person who I had very minimal awareness of. Bob Moses is just a real powerhouse as a mid-20-something activist who was so important throughout the Mississippi Freedom Summer and was also involved in the Selma movement. It just seems like a very compassionate, thoughtful individual, particularly training, organizing, and processing the experiences of 1964 for a ton of new activists coming from all over the country, even as some of those activists were being murdered by white supremacists and law enforcement throughout Mississippi. So yeah, Bob Moses, just really a true hero.
Absolutely, absolutely. Next question is kind of a little bit of a show and tell, Nate. Patrice O'Donoghue asks, do you have a favorite page in book one? And if so, can you show it to us?
Yeah, you bet. I have two favorites. One of my favorites is here on page 28. It's simply, this is during John Lewis's famous chicken stories. When he talks about his early experiences with public speaking and with preaching, had to do with preaching to his chickens, who he took care of on the family farm. But it's this page right here where he's preaching and reciting verse to his chickens, and just really taken over by the power of the words he's speaking, the way he really feels like the Spirit of the Lord is being channeled through him, but the way that this sort of prepares him for action and for leadership in his adult life. Imagining that the chickens were his congregation, and me, I was a preacher. And the verse here being, blessed be the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I really like just this nice ending before the situation gets more complicated at age 11. My other favorite is simply on the moment of his first arrest in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. This moment of liberation for him, where he's being grabbed and arrested with 80-something other activists. It's like, I was not afraid. I felt free, liberated, like I had crossed over. This is an all-time favorite of mine. And I love just the sense of transcendence that young John Lewis was feeling and experiencing at this moment, being transformed by it, but living, fearlessly in the middle of it.
Awesome. We're getting a lot of questions in here now.
You bet.
Let me see. This one's kind of heavy. Nora asks, do you believe that racial equity or racism has gotten better with the age of social media? Do you believe social media could have a stronger impact in raising awareness?
That's a really good question. And I think, I got to say, I think the answer to this has more to do with a shift in the role of social media in the last decade. Earlier in this decade, I think I would have a lot more positive things to say about the power of social media as an organizing tool, as a tool of expression, as a way to actually level the playing field in terms of people's voices being able to get out to the world and communicate. And I saw it in much more optimistic terms. I tend to see more of the gatekeeping qualities, the echo chamber qualities, the divisive qualities of social media now. In the long view of history, yes, I do believe that we are closer to a dream of racial equality than we have been at any point in my life. However, I can't say in good faith that I think that social media is necessarily fostering and empowering a lot of those positive changes. I see it as an organizing tool and a megaphone that's used across the political spectrum. But I do think that it is more powerfully and effectively used by authoritarian and white supremacist forces. And I tend to see it more as having I have more of an oppositional and complicated relationship to social media now. But yeah, I mean, it's true, but it's hard to say. It doesn't settle right with me to say that we have seen long-term improvement, but I know that that is true. A lot of that is recognizing that a lot of the terror, the violence, the backlash, the authoritarianism is simultaneously a part of a reaction against these broader long-term successes towards a truly multiracial society, towards true equality, towards a truer sense of justice and accountability. So I don't know, in this present moment, I think it's really hard to see things with that long view. I know I struggle to, but I also know that that long view does show progress.
And then another one here that's I think kind of ties back. This is a question from Martha Beck to something you mentioned earlier. You said that white supremacy is not stagnant, I think is what you said, in the context of, the opposition can take things that you were using, you being the civil rights movement, to help further equity and to use that to legitimize, or I think you said mainstream eyes. Can I say mainstream eyes?
Sure, yeah.
The opposition to that movement. And that's why what I think about when I give you this comment from Martha Beck. She says, I think there should be a discussion on the importance of social justice gospel. The letter from the Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King is one example. The tradition was deliberately condemned after 9/11 and replaced by more state-connected religion. And then ultimately she gets to the point, she said, it's so important for white people to think more about traditional connection between social change, social justice, and the Christian church. So with that comment, and I want to add to it a little bit if I can, Martha, when you're studying or talking to John Lewis, obviously their faith was a big part of this.
Yes.
How do you see people using faith to fight against even them back then or where we are today?
Well, I mean, what is doubtless is that, central to the effectiveness of not just the civil rights movement, but, the ongoing movement for what Hassan Kwame Jeffries would call freedom rights, is the power of faith as a galvanizing and organizing tool, but specifically the power of the Black church in America. And growing up, growing up white middle class in the South, in the Presbyterian church, the church that I grew up going to was and is very cool. But at the same time, this really shows how a lot of the divisions from the hyper-segregated South continued well into my lifetime in terms of simply keeping social circles, and that includes the social circles of faith, away from awareness of each other's function, not only philosophy and outlook, but the work that the different groups of people throughout our communities are doing. And so, yes, without a doubt, the power of the Black church in America is central to the success of ongoing civil and human rights movements throughout the country. And I really enjoyed hearing stories from Congressman Lewis about being a boy and his first experiences hearing Dr. King on the radio in the mid-1950s, just out of his house, in Troy, Alabama, when Dr. King was a Montgomery preacher, but a growing awareness of the social gospel and the applications of the social gospel, so that his awareness of it prior to his involvement with nonviolence and with the sit-in movement made him equipped to be able to recognize that these are part and parcel of the same thing. I mean, also the fact that John Lewis and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette, all these crucial early young activists within SNCC and within early SCLC were being trained for nonviolent protest by religious leaders, often in the physical space of the church itself. The physical space of the church itself was consistently used to house, shield, feed, and provide medical attention for, at times, hundreds of protesters who were fleeing white supremacist violence or fleeing oppression from law enforcement in the wake of their protests. If you want to view this through the lens of a war, to recognize the function of the Black church in America as fortress as well as organizing point, it's essential.
And I know we're bumping up against the time, but there were a couple questions. There were more technical questions, Nate,
Sure.
and I kind of give those lift those up real quickly before we run out of time. And this was about your artwork as an artist. One of which was how much time goes into, creating a comic book in this sense? How much background do you have to do?
Oh,
and
yeah.
then two, the power of imagery. How do you determine which images to depict? Do you focus more on the protagonist in the story? Do you struggle with how much art goes to those who were opposed to the movement? So we kind of want to talk about the art of the comic.
Those are both excellent questions. In a nutshell, what's great about making comics is that it's, in my opinion, the most accessible, economic, democratic, with a little d, kind of mass storytelling available. Really, all you need is something to draw with, something to draw on, and an idea. And whether it's published online or photocopied or whatever, it's not hard to get your ideas from a starting point into someone else's hands or seen by someone else's eyes. In terms of how much time I put into a comic, really to break it down at a page by page rate, it's about 5 hours from start to finish for each page. And
how many pages are in the trilogy?
About 550, something like that. And then I probably did 20 pages that I wound up getting taken out of the book just here and there or redrawn. But a lot of that has to do with the work that goes into the script, which that's not even counted. That's like 2 years of work before I got on board. And then you move through, you read the script and you break it down into panels and pages. You pencil the entire thing, you pencil in your lettering, you edit the script on the page as lettering, then you letter it in ink, then you ink the pencils, and then I use these sort of gray washes with watered down ink. And then you get on Photoshop and clean it all up. It is time consuming. It's something that at that level, you definitely have to have a real hunger to make comics to do it. But yeah, it's no joke. It's about 5 hours a page. And eventually I was up to about 8 or 10 pages a week as we got into March book 3, and it just became all consuming. But once you get in the groove, like, you just want to go with it.
Right.
And as far as part 2 of that question, how to pick images, that's a really great question, because I think one misunderstanding about reading comics is that the only information is the textual information, and that the images are just pictures that go with the text. Comics is a blend of image and word, and there's a lot of non-verbal information that's put into the images in March. So yeah, basically reading through Congressman Lewis and Andrew's script, one of the important things I had to do was kind of read between the lines of the script and recognize, because like, while I'm reading the script, I'm also doing my own secondary research and reference, whether it's for locations and likenesses, or rereading different accounts of history and seeing if anything fell through the cracks. You know, there are times I left things out and I'd get caught for that. There were also times where Congressman Lewis and Andrew let something slip between the cracks. And so we looked out for each other and made sure that the sides were covered. But yeah, importantly, recognizing that if there were details that could be conveyed visually as opposed to being written, you should lean towards doing that. And it's more effective as a comic. In storytelling, this is known as the show, don't tell rule. And so comics leans on that a lot. There were times, especially I think in March book 2, when you're talking about changing point of view or changing focus on particular people involved within this history, there are moments in which I sort of flip the camera so that the reader is forced into a position to see things from a white supremacist attacker's point of view. I'm thinking right now of early on in the Freedom Rides in Rock Hill, South Carolina, at one of their very first stops, making a decision after John Lewis is punched and attacked by members of the Klan. As he's recovering from the impact of the first punch, the camera, you don't realize it till here, has now flipped, and the reader is the white supremacist punching him in the face. And this is the kind of thing where it kind of can fly under your radar as a reader, but as soon as you are consciously aware of it, there's a wave of repulsion where you feel complicit with the attack, no matter who you are, or you should. A lot of March, if I did my job properly, should read as horror. So there are moments where, by resensitizing myself to these depictions of violence, if I did my job properly, actually produces a horrific, repulsive response. So I do try to manipulate all of us as readers a little bit by forcing us way, way out of our comfort zones when gaining an understanding of this history.
Well, thank you for that description, because, and I'm glad those attendees asked those technical questions, because I wouldn't have known enough to ask those type of questions, but it definitely gives a different perspective to your work and how much work it takes to get to a point where we can flip through a comic book and absorb history in a way that we normally do not do. So Nate Powell, thank you again for your work. Thank you again for being with us on today to discuss your work and your relationship with Congressman John Lewis, and look forward to picking up and reading book 1 and the other parts of the trilogy. Nate Coulter, I know we're right up at 1 o'clock, so do I kick it back to you or Kay?
Either one. KK, are you there? Or Grayson?
Yes, I'm here.
Y'all want to take it from here? Thanks, Director Phillips. We really appreciate it. And thanks, Nate Powell. That was splendid.
Thanks to both of y'all. I really appreciate it. It's an honor.
Yeah, absolutely.